Thank you. I would like to start on behalf of the iPrEx team to express our sincere condolences for those who we lost during the MH17 tragedy. Joe Blanche was a PrEP researcher, supporter, and mentor in the field. This is a quote from Joe in one of its perspective that demonstrates that the critical need for activism in the field of PrEP research, and we hope to honor his legacy by continuing our PrEP advocacy and activism. There is no other areas of medicine where activism has been so strong and has accomplished so much as in HIV/AIDS. Let's be a little brave and stand up to protect that legacy. So the iPrEx study was an efficacy trial that enrolled 2,499 MSM and transgender women at 11 sites in 6 countries. After the success of the iPrEx results, this study continued with an open-label extension phase, following the international ethical recommendations for the conduct of clinical research suggested by the Declaration of Health Thinking and the World Health Organization. The open-label extension enrolled 1,770 participants, regardless of their HIV status, meaning that participants who were HIV positive were invited to participate. And the study leadership understood that PrEP is not for everyone, so enrollment in OLE was also open to those participants who did not want to take PrEP, but wanted to benefit from the medical care services provided by the study sites. The iPrEx study followed participants for 72 weeks between early 2011 and the end of 2013. Throughout the conduct of the study, the iPrEx study team has been very active in the implementation of formative work, conducting interviews and discussion groups with participants, and generating forums for the active discussion of HIV prevention research and new HIV prevention technologies with stakeholders. Topics that motivated this formative work were related to information needs from the communities, motivations to participate in clinical research, adherence, perception of study participation, among other topics. Interestingly, participants in global iPrEx, the blinded phase of the study, reported that their major motivation to participate in the study were the healthcare services provided in the study settings, since they were considered confidential, respectful, and of high quality. Altruism and commitment to help make the difference in the course of the epidemic in the countries, and in minor degree, possibilities that the study offers as benefits for study participants. Socializing opportunities, reimbursement, condoms, and other goods that the study provided. As for the motivators to enroll in iPrEx OLE, coincidentally, participants reported the provision of healthcare services as the most important motivator. Participants felt so proud of having contributed to achieve the study results and felt entitled to benefit from the intervention and from other benefits that the study offered. But PrEP is not for everybody. Some believe that condoms were still okay in their sex life and they stick to it. I use condoms, so I did not want to take the medication. Some feared that at the end of the iPrEx OLE, the intervention was not going to be available, so they did not want to take the study medication, but still wanted to enjoy of the services that the study provided at the study sites. I did not want to be on PrEP because the study was going to end, and then what? That's a quote from a participant that enrolling only off PrEP. Some other participants reported not taking the study medication because of the side effects. I was taken through iPrEx, blinded, and had adverse events, so I decided to enroll in off PrEP in OLE. But for those who felt that PrEP was for them, some considered that they wanted to enjoy the benefit of an intervention that they contributed to achieve. I learned about the results and chose to be on PrEP. Other participants reported that the intervention as a whole was protective, not only the medication per se, which leads us to think that PrEP should be part of a comprehensive provision of services. I decided to choose PrEP because I was going to be protected by the pills, the counselors, and the physicians at the study site. Some reported that they were going to use other prevention tools that go from knowing who I go to bed with to using condoms. Now that the study has ended, I will start using condoms that I get from my sisters who get them at the family planning services. As mentioned before, the iPrEx study team did its best at following international ethical recommendations for the conduct of clinical research. Before, during, and after the iPrEx team has been constantly consulting with stakeholders and participants. As mentioned before, the study considered the provision of post-trial access for additional 72 weeks. As part of the community education activities, iPrEx sites facilitated the education initiative and discussion forums to discuss issues related to HIV prevention research and new prevention technologies. The iPrEx study provided a standard of prevention and ancillary care that in the end is very much acknowledged by participants. FTC TDF for treatment is approved in all countries where the iPrEx study took place but one, Peru. But an application has been submitted in 2012 and is pending of approval by the Peruvian FDA. However, I would like to quote a question that Bridget Hare and Christopher Jordans asked in a paper published in 2013. Oops, sorry. How can investigators deliver access to a product over which they have limited control? So let's see what was the advocacy movement around PrEP in the United States. So as soon as the iPrEx results were announced, there was an immediate discussion on how PrEP will affect the provision of treatment to people living with HIV. And there was the fear of the competence between the use of medications for prevention and the use of medication for treatment. Other discussions were about the medicalization of prevention, the fear of behavioral disinhibition, and that the efficacy will depend on adherence, and how likely will it be that beneficiaries of the intervention would be adherent. However, before the announcement of iPrEx results, there was a PrEP activist movement in the United States with organizations such as AVAC, Project Inform, San Francisco AIDS Foundation of Chicago, that enabled the generation of a positive environment leading to the approval of FTC-TDF by the FDA and access to PrEP in the United States. Demo projects were investigator-initiated in the United States, and participants that were not longer in clinical trials had the chance to participate in demonstration projects in the US. Once the CDC guidelines were released a month ago, there were more than 150 US organizations and individuals that supported and endorsed the CDC guidelines, despite there were movements that were against the guidelines about PrEP. In parallel, in 2011, the CDC released the guidance on PrEP, and in 2012, there were a lot of milestones where the FDA approved PrEP, TDF for PrEP. The South Africans released their PrEP guidelines for MSM, and WHO released a guidance for demonstration projects as recommendations for countries. And in 2014, the CDC released the guidelines on PrEP, and a week ago, the WHO released the consolidated guidelines. But meanwhile, the regulatory process was going on in the United States, and I believe that most countries were expecting what that process was. But something occurred in May of 2014. Post magazine published an article on its webpage wondering what is going to happen to post-trial access to iPrEx study participants outside of the United States. The article was called "Thanks for Nothing, iPrEx Volunteers Shut Out of PrEP Success." Most foreign volunteers who participated in a clinical trial that first proved Truvada prevents HIV no longer have access to the drug. So to understand this better, let's discuss what happened in the Andean study sites in contrast with the PrEP advocacy movement in the United States while these years. In 2011, the World Health Organization sponsored two stakeholder consultations in Peru and Ecuador. And these consultations convened health regulation agencies of the countries plus health policymakers. At that time, from the perspective of the regulators and the government officers, the recommendations were to conduct pilot studies that at the time were being designed in the United States and that do have much sense to evaluate how feasible a program like this, a PrEP program, might fit in the health system of these countries. Despite that Peru and Ecuador have concentrated epidemics, government officials were very much interested in the results from other trials in other populations such as women and heterosexuals. And they suggested that we should wait back in 2011 for the release of the results of these other trials. The need of doing cost-benefit analysis of the implementation of an intervention that might be very expensive because of the cost of FTC-TDF in those countries. What they consider a priority was an intervention that could benefit serodiscordant couples and especially women. But something that they most of all acknowledge is to improve the existing HIV prevention services in these countries before making any decision of implementing a PrEP program in their countries. However, from the activist point of view, what they recommended in these stakeholder consultations was that TDF-FTC should be insured for people that already had HIV and that could benefit the most of the medication. They acknowledged that there was a need to do some advocacy about making PrEP a new tool in the HIV prevention toolbox, and there was a need of focusing on populations in such a way that these populations feel that they have ownership of PrEP as a combination prevention strategy for themselves. As we can see, regulators and health officers had different interests and agendas regarding the implementation of PrEP as an alternative HIV prevention tool. And the question is, what shall be done in the context of future HIV prevention trials? How are we gonna be dealing with the implementation of an intervention that could be very costly for some countries? So what I believe needs to be done next is that providers and stakeholders need to be educating on new HIV prevention strategies, acknowledge that PrEP is not for everybody but should be a tool in the toolbox, accessible and affordable. Communities need to demand effective HIV prevention strategies that reduce their risk of acquiring HIV, and there is a need of speeding up the regulatory processes for approval of FTC-TDF for prevention. I don't know if I have, so I do have testimony of a participant in Rio de Janeiro about PrEP and the approaching time that the study was going to be over. So I wanted to share this with you.
Olá, meu nome é Lúcio, tenho 44 anos e vivo na cidade do Rio de Janeiro, no Brasil. A minha decisão no uso do medicamento foi devido à minha atividade sexual ser alta. Então, além de eu ter um parceiro fixo, eu tenho relacionamento extraconjugais. Eu diria que eles investissem mais e que dessem acesso ao medicamento a todos, não só do Brasil, mas ao mundo inteiro, que o medicamento tivesse acesso fácil para que todos pudessem participar, tomar e garantir assim a prevenção do HIV. Eu gostaria de saber se, após o estudo, eu terei acesso aos medicamentos gratuitamente. Essa é a minha maior preocupação. Eu gostaria, como a medicação faz parte da minha vida, eu não gostaria de deixar a medicação. Então, eu gostaria de saber se eu terei acesso após o estudo.
And I want to thank the 2,499 iPrEx participants who made it possible to learn that daily oral PrEP is effective in preventing HIV acquisition in gay men, transgender women, and other men who have sex with men. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. That was really excellent, and I think highlights some of the really key issues of concern to this symposium around how communities and publics understand research participation in it and the benefits that do or don't derive to them for that participation. And one of the most interesting things I thought you mentioned at the beginning was the participants who seemed to know, maybe because you told them, that PrEP would not be available to them after the trial and didn't want to take the drug, but it's also interesting about those who chose to, knowing that that was the case. So I don't know if you want to say more about that, but meanwhile, we do have time for a couple of quick questions or clarifying questions or comments, if anybody from the audience has one. We'll take more discussion at the end, but we wanted to allow any kind of quick response. If you could keep it as brief as possible. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just quite interested in, obviously the American activism was very visible and there's already very strong networks that kind of help that activism come forward, and probably for many of us in the room it was conducted in English, so it's more visible to us. How would you kind of characterize the level of engagement and interest and activism around PrEP in Peru and Ecuador?
Okay, I guess, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question. I think that we have to take into consideration where the LGBT or gay movement is in these countries. I guess the agenda of these movements, at least in the case of PrEP for MSM, is that they are still fighting for their basic needs and their basic human rights. The agenda of the LGBT movement in Peru comes to acknowledge that LGBT rights should be, that the state should protect the Peruvian citizens regardless of their sexual orientation, fight that has been already lost. Other theme in the agenda is gay marriage and the regulation of hate crimes. So I guess the agenda of those movements are much more into basic human rights needs than into health and HIV prevention interventions. During the discussions in the consultations, most of the activists demanded that, first of all, before having very sophisticated HIV prevention interventions, we must assure access to basic public services for all citizens, regardless of their sexual orientation, and to broaden the coverage of ARV treatment for people that were living with HIV. So in terms of PrEP activism, I have to say that there has not been much, although the study sites in Peru and Ecuador did a great effort trying to put the theme in the agenda. PrEP was not one of the priorities at that time.
Let's take one more and then we'll move on.
Sure. Kenyon Farrell from Treatment Action Group in the U.S. Question, one of the things that I've noticed in the United States context is a lot of the sort of community engagement around PrEP, particularly among Black and Latino MSM in the United States, and especially younger folks, actually served as a way to actually engage community around the kind of basic HIV treatment science in general. So friends of mine who are organizing some of these community events in New York City and in Atlanta and places like that were finding that people were not only just interested in PrEP, but were still had a lot of kind of myths about treatment in terms of side effects, in terms of the amount of pills people with HIV had to take, all of these sorts of things. And so I'm curious, how much of the, kind of community engagement piece of your study, did you also have to kind of engage just a different level of kind of where people were understanding just where we are in terms of the science? That I feel like we have actually, in the United States, actually in some ways kind of abandoned just the basic kind of education piece, right? Because we're getting these questions. So I'm just curious, how did that play out in your study sites?
So at least from the Andean study sites perspective, the fact that there is an alternative for HIV prevention and that they could benefit from that intervention meant a lot for most of the participants that decided to be on PrEP in the open label extension phase. They believed that they were really vulnerable and that intervention was going to be another layer of protection for them. In terms of the fact that people were medicalizing prevention, that wasn't a discussion that was much into the debate. The thing that mostly happened in these Andean sites were that these clinical trials were providing intervention that probably was not accessible to them in their home countries. And I'm not talking only about PrEP, I'm talking about other HIV prevention technologies like post-exposure prophylaxis, for example, that in Peru and Ecuador is only allowed for work injuries and not for other people. And some of the greatest discussions that we had during this consultation is why do not these countries really consider that as another prevention option. And the regulators and the policymakers were saying that if vulnerable populations couldn't deal with the use of condoms, then what they had to do is really work harder on that provision of these basic HIV prevention services rather than investing more in other technologies that they really didn't know if they were going to work in their system.